In today's talk, you will learn about how to effectively deal with challenging situations, including confrontations, which is something that most people would rather avoid. You will learn about at least 3 big reasons why things need to be dealt with, and why it's better not to avoid dealing with challenging and unpleasant issues. You will learn about the worst possible way to deal with a challenging situation, as well as how best to deal with confrontations and challenging situations. Keep listening to learn more. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Growth Philosophy Podcast, a bite-sized weekly podcast focused on empowering you to think better and upgrade your life. So let's talk about handling challenging situations and confrontations. Confrontations, no one likes them. No one likes confrontations. They're difficult and unpleasant. However, often things need to be brought out in the open and need to be dealt with, because if they're not dealt with, they keep festering. When issues are not dealt with, they keep festering like a wound that's not dealt with, and keeps getting worse and worse as time goes by and can eventually become gangrenous. In the same way one small scratch can become a huge gangrenous wound, one small issue left unchecked can become a huge thing. The longer an issue is left in the dark, unresolved, the worse it usually gets. This is perhaps the biggest lesson I have learned from all my years. It might feel like not dealing with things head on is the easier and the less stressful thing to do, but trust me, it isn't. Why? Because that oppressive, heavy feeling that comes from the issue just hanging in the air doesn't just go away. You can try to ignore it and just go on with your life, but it will keep hanging over your head, that oppressive feeling. And it'll keep making you feel uncomfortable and even stressed. There are at least 3 big reasons why unpleasant and challenging issues need to be dealt with head on. Number 1, because the longer an issue is left unchecked and unchallenged and unresolved, the worse usually it gets. So that's the first big one. Number 2, because ignoring that feeling of uneasiness is pretty much impossible. So that's the second big reason. And number 3, because many a time the issue might actually end up being nothing you needed to be concerned about. But you can only know that if you actually deal with it. So that's the third big one. Over the course of this talk, we will explore these and other reasons why dealing with things is better than avoiding them. I recently ran a small survey to find out how common it is for people to avoid dealing with things. Of the 253 people I asked, 77% of them said that they try to avoid confrontations even if avoidance is ultimately a bad idea. Let me put it another way. Only 23% of the people I asked would prefer to deal with things head on. So only 23% of people prefer to face things head on, whereas 77% of the people prefer to just avoid dealing with things. I have to admit, I was a bit surprised by this outcome. When I initiated that survey, I sort of knew that the majority would say that they would prefer to avoid dealing with things. And I expected it to be something like 60% or so who would prefer avoidance, but not nearly 80%. That was eye-opening and made me realize just how important this topic is. You might think that not dealing with a challenging issue is easier. It might feel like that, but it isn't. It isn't ultimately easier because that oppressive, heavy feeling that comes from having an unresolved issue just keeps hanging in the air as long as it is unresolved. That oppressive feeling doesn't go away. You can try to ignore it and go on with your life, but it will keep bothering you. And I'm pretty sure you know exactly what I mean. Everyone has experienced that. So, not dealing with it does not just make it go away. It keeps on hanging over your head. The biggest reason for dealing with issues head-on, though, is the fact that if they're not resolved, they have a tendency to become worse and worse over time. This is why small issues become massive challenges and even more hills become mountains. When things crop up, they need to be dealt with, because the alternative causes more anxiety, unhappiness, frustration, and a whole bunch of negative, harmful, and unwanted feelings. It's hard to feel good and feel positive when there is something just hanging in the background that feels like a dark cloud over your head, a cloud that blocks the light of happiness and positive emotions. That feeling continues to chip away at you the longer it's left unresolved. Ignoring things might help in the short term, but in the long term, it usually makes things worse, as the longer it's left unresolved, the worse it gets. I know that it's not easy to deal with issues head-on. Confrontations are uncomfortable and unpleasant, but unfortunately, they are necessary. Why are they necessary, you might ask? They are necessary because you can't run away from problems. You might think you can. You might think that you can just bottle things up or brush the concerns and issues under the mat or lock them up in your mental vault so that they can't come out, but they always do. Unresolved issues have a way of getting out in the open. Always. It's not a question of if they'll come out, but when. And when they come out on their own, especially if they've been left unresolved and especially if they've been festering for some time, they might just burst out there with a big bang and create chaos and havoc and a huge mess. Exactly the things you were trying to avoid by avoiding dealing with the issue. So you get exactly what you did not want. Not dealing with issues gets you negative results down the line, pretty much always. People think letting things go unresolved will make their lives easier, but pretty much always it does the opposite. In fact, I can't think of any instance where not dealing with an issue that's bugging you is a good idea. Not just because the issue can get worse over time, but also because it just hangs over you ominously and it stays with you in the background and it just feels like a negative pressure that makes it hard for you to be happy. Maybe you are an exception to the majority and can ignore issues and go on with your life as if nothing is different. Maybe you are great at just letting things go unresolved and not letting it bother you in the slightest. But even then, if that is the case, it's still better to deal with them. It is still better to deal with them because even though you might be good at just ignoring them, the others involved very well won't be. And then there is also the matter of things getting worse as issues are left unresolved. Here is something else for you to consider. You have the issue nagging near the back of your mind because your subconscious knows that it is something that needs to be dealt with, and as such keeps nagging at you. Even though the issue feels unpleasant and stressful to deal with and to bring it out in the open, and even though confrontations are hard and complicated and stressful, your subconscious mind realizes that it is something that should not be left unresolved and that it needs to be brought out in the light. No one likes confrontations, but unfortunately, most of the time they just cannot be avoided. Don't stir up trouble just for the sake of it, of course, but if it's an issue that's bothering you and just gnawing at you, and if it's something that keeps on making you uncomfortable, then it is something that needs to be handled. If the issue is something that is refusing to go away and continues to shed a black shadow on your mood and is continually nagging at you, then it is something that needs to be addressed. Because that's your subconscious telling you that you have to deal with this. Personally, I absolutely hate confrontations. Hate them. That said, I don't run away from them. Because I know that often the things you want to avoid the most are the ones that you need to deal with the most. It's unpleasant, but it's necessary. Life isn't always easy. All this sounds challenging and not very happy or light or positive, but let me assure you, there is a positive side to this all. And here is how and why. When you finally deal with the things you have been trying to avoid, or ignore, or even been trying to run away from, when you finally confront them and deal with it head on, you bring it out in the open and get clarity and resolution, and most importantly, you get rid of the dark cloud hanging over your head. This is yet another big reason why it's important to talk things out and face the things you need to face, as otherwise there is a risk that your brain will build up all sorts of doomsday stories and worst case scenarios. We humans have an inherent negativity bias and often assume the worst. So it's better to just deal with things and talk things through and clarify things, because for all you know, there actually is absolutely nothing to be concerned about. But you can only know that by actually facing it. You might think that by avoiding dealing with an issue, you are avoiding turning a mountain out of a molehill, but pretty much always the opposite is what you get. As pretty much always, a molehill becomes a mountain in your mind when things are left unresolved. So do yourself and those you care about a favor and deal with the things that are bothering you. If it's bothering you after a day or even after several days, then it's clearly a sign from your psyche, and maybe even from the universe, that the matter needs to be addressed. Remember, things in the dark fester, whereas things in the light heal. Bring the issues out in the light. It will not be easy, but ultimately it will be for the best. Here is the bottom line. The longer an issue goes unresolved, the more stress and negativity and anxiety it causes, and pretty much always the worse it gets. This is something I have learned myself over the years, often the hard way, and it is also an insight that you will find to be true when you read about psychology and neuroscience and relationships, not to mention your own past experiences. As such, it is always better, in the long term, to deal with things rather than ignore them. As for how to deal with unpleasant and challenging issues, the best way to deal with them is to do it calmly. Remember that. Calm is the key word there. Losing your temper usually makes things worse, and is the worst possible way to deal with an issue. It might not be easy to stay calm when dealing with a challenging issue, especially if it is really close and personal. But there are things you can do that can help, like journaling. Journaling about the issue and writing down whatever it is that's bothering you and why, in as much detail as possible, can be quite helpful and cathartic even. Listen, ultimately the goal is to clear the air and deal with the issue, not argue for the sake of arguing. In fact, heated arguments often can be counterproductive. So don't just rush into it like a bull in a china shop and create a huge mess. Think about it and just lay out in the open and deal with it as calmly as possible. I'm not saying things might not get heated, as they might, but don't get into it with the goal of to just get angry. Venting is fine, but confrontation just for the sake of confrontation leads nowhere and only makes things worse. Of course, you'll want to talk because you need to get whatever it is that's bothering you out in the open, but you also have to listen. It absolutely has to be a two-way communication channel if you stand any chance of actually resolving the issue. No one likes confrontations, but it often has to be done. It has to be done because often that's the only way to get things that are bugging you and bothering you out in the open. and because that's often the best way to deal with things. As long as you're willing to listen and genuinely want to resolve things rather than simply feed your ego, confrontations can lead to a lot of good. Confrontations can be a valuable thing, as they can help start effective conversations and communication, but only if you let them. So be willing to listen at least as much as you speak, ideally more. Our conversation is your ultimate goal, not an argument. Keep that in mind. Arguing for the sake of arguing is pointless and unpleasant, so realize that you have to be willing to listen if you're going to resolve the issue, especially if it is something significant or important. If you just want to vent, however, that's okay too, as sometimes the issue might simply be about letting the people involved know about something that made you unhappy. Don't just argue for the sake of arguing, but don't just avoid dealing with things that really bother you. No one likes confrontations, but you absolutely can use them to clear the air, get clarity, and resolve issues before they fester and create a huge mess. Always remember this: the sooner you deal with challenging things, the better. It rarely is easy or pleasant, but it is necessary. And it can lead to better things, especially when you genuinely want to resolve things and listen. What do you usually do when something challenging crops up? Do you usually avoid dealing with the issue, or do you face it head on? Let me know. I would be very interested to know about this. So let me know about that, along with any other tips or suggestions you may have about dealing with challenging situations. So that's it for today. I hope you found this talk useful and learned at least one thing that can positively impact your life. I'll catch you again next week. Same place, same time. Alright everyone, take care of yourselves and have a great week.